If there's one thing that people with tight hamstrings can't go a long time without, it's stretching. And more often than not, people who deal with this chronic sense of tightness really can't go more than a couple days without it. The truth is, you can stretch these muscles all you want, all day long. But until you address the underlying mechanism behind why that tightness is reoccurring or there to begin with, you'll forever be caught in this cycle of having to stretch, feeling the sense of tightness, and then inevitably going back to stretching. I think one of the biggest misconceptions in the rehab and fitness industry is that if a muscle is tight, then it is obviously short. The tricky thing with the body is it can provide a sense of feedback when the muscle isn't necessarily short, but actually already maxed out at a lengthened state. I'm gonna use this elastic band as an example. We'll pretend that this is your hamstring muscle. We'll say that this is your hips and this is your knee. Now, if they are perfectly stacked on top of one another, obviously this is going to change with motion, but for this, we'll just say that they are perfectly stacked. There is going to be some level of slack in that tissue, and that's actually healthy. That's what we're looking for. But if I take my pelvis up here, and I take it into an anterior tilt, and then say I hyperextend my knee, we can see how much tension gets on this hamstring tissue as a result of that. Now, that's not necessarily a muscular issue, but actually a joint positioning issue. So the reason why you may potentially be experiencing that feedback is because the joints are in a misalignment, or you have a difficult time starting at neutral and then going to varying degrees of it as you go through movement. Now, what often happens with people who have tight hamstrings is they will have some varying degree of a pelvic and knee orientation that necessarily isn't neutral. And then they'll go and stretch that tissue even further. So what ends up happening is we stretch this tissue. If I hold this here and do this repeatedly for long enough, and then I come back to that position, now there's some slack. So this feels momentarily good because we've created slack in the tissue. But the problem with it is we didn't actually change the orientation of where the pelvis and the knee were. So then what happens? We go back to our daily movement, our same patterns, and this tightness inevitably comes back. And all of a sudden, my hamstrings are tight again. I gotta stretch. And then the whole cycle ends up repeating itself. So this is all to say, the way out of this isn't gonna be just chronically stretching your hamstring muscles. It's actually gonna be changing the relative joint positioning and how the tissue actually functions as you move through different ranges of motion. So with that explanation out of the way, let's get into some exercises that break this down further. So my theory is that if we truly want to restore a hamstring length in a functional way, we want to make sure that the nerves and the nervous system is on board with that. So what that means is for this first exercise, we're going to work on not only creating length through the hamstring, but also through the nerves around it. And we're going to focus on a hamstring nerve glide. For this exercise, you are going to start on your back. You're going to have one knee in a deep bend, with your other leg just at 90 degrees, more or less, and you're gonna take your other hand to the back side of the thigh. Now, before we start adding length through the hamstring fibers, as well as through the nerve associated to it, we just wanna be mindful that the pelvis and the rib cage is somewhat neutral. And how we can do that is just imagine that there's gonna be a subtle curve between our hips and our rib cage. A very subtle lordotic curve is okay. We don't wanna be in excessive hyperextension, but we also don't wanna be just smashing our back into the lower ground where you're just overflexing your abdominal muscles. So now that we've established some level of neutrality between those two spaces, what we're gonna start to do is extend the knee while we continue to pull or keep pressure on our thigh, kind of pulling towards us. So we're working this opposing tension of my knee slightly being pulled in while I'm kicking away. The intention here is to not hyperextend your knee and just lock your knee out as hard as you can. Ideally, as you're going through this, you should be experiencing some hamstring length happening, also some nerve length being created through that. And when you get to the end range, you can also play with going into a plantar flexion and a dorsiflexion, or really just pressing your toes away from you and bringing them back towards the shin. For this next one, you already know, if you've been around here for a while, we're gonna go to some hamstring rollouts. For this one, you can grab yourself a foam roller. You can also use a basketball, a medicine ball, anything that has some roll to it that you can start with your feet on. To begin with this one, we are gonna take our hands to our lower back. Again, just using the hands as a feedback mechanism to make sure that we're not going into overextension, but just having a varying degree of lordotic curve there. Now, once we have that established, it's gonna be really important that we start with the ankles in a dorsiflexion. I don't want you to try to be pointing the toes too far away. We're just gonna have the toes up towards the shin as a means to bring more contraction into the hamstring fibers. So we got the hip set, we got the rib cage set, we also have the ankles in position, and now we are gonna slowly start to bring the hips up into a bridge position. And from here, we are gonna slowly start to go into a pull in. So we're gonna go into a deep contraction of the hamstrings. Again, being mindful that we're not going into a hyperextension in any particular area, keeping things neutral while the hamstrings get loaded. And then we're gently gonna start to go into a roll away. This will really begin to challenge the hamstring fibers and how they relate to things like the hips and the orientation of the hips. And not only are we experiencing some contraction and length through the tissues of the hamstrings, but we're also developing a really important relationship between how the hamstring musculature works relative to things like the hips. If you're not feeling the hamstrings already, be prepared to really feel them in this next one. We are gonna start on our back with both feet up against the wall. In this exercise, we're gonna start to work into some single leg orientation, which is gonna challenge the hamstring fibers just that much more and really challenge the stability factor around the pelvis as well. So to begin, we're gonna take both feet up against the wall, and you're just gonna start with a gentle pressure coming down into the wall to just start to sense and bring some feedback into the hamstrings. And we're gonna use that to gently draw the pelvis off the ground. Now, once we're here, we're just gonna be mindful of that relationship between the pelvis and the rib cage once more. I know I'm repeating myself a lot, but it's super important that you draw attention to that. So now that we have the hips slightly off the floor, we have some feedback into both hamstrings. What we're gonna do is take one foot off the ground, and you're gonna try to not change the orientation of your pelvis as you are taking your foot off the wall. What is gonna happen here is with whatever foot you do have on the wall, you are gonna get a ton of feedback into that hamstring. We're still keeping that drawdown effect of it going into the wall to support the hips in that position. And just be mindful if there's a tendency for your hips to shift, over rotate, or maybe you're starting to bring some tension into your upper body, into your neck, or into other areas to try to create stability. See if you can keep the upper body pretty quiet, you're not over tensioning your neck or anything like that. We are gonna really try to keep this mostly isolated to the hamstring and feeding stability into the hips from that. Now, as we always do, we are gonna finish with some dynamic and rhythmic work. On this channel, we don't only focus on contracting and isolating muscles, we start to look at the bigger picture and how things link together. And more importantly, how does this dynamically start to integrate together? So for today's movement, we're gonna work on some walking rhythmic hinges. What this is initially gonna look like is you're just gonna bring yourself into a split stance position, and I just want you to dynamically work in and out of a hinge. Think you're almost kind of pumping your hamstring, but you're trying to keep it under somewhat of a consistent tension as you're going through the movement. So we're gonna be taking the hips back into a flexion, taking that up into extension, and just being mindful that the hamstring and the tissues around there are staying online as we're working through it. So now that the hamstrings have been primed in this more dynamic way, really all we're gonna start to do is add a step. So we're gonna start to step forward. We're gonna think about catching the momentum in that hinge. We're gonna stand up dynamically with that, and then just gonna receive that momentum and energy on the opposing side. You can certainly work in tools like kettlebells, dumbbells, medicine balls, a basketball to add some feedback and rotation into the upper body. But if you just wanted to start to get used to priming the hamstrings in a little bit more of a dynamic fashion, then I would suggest just going through this with body weight. This movement will not only allow for hamstring length to occur, but also hamstring contraction. Because we're working through both opposing functions of going into a deep hip flexion as well as hip extension, we're allowing the hamstring to operate at both extremes of where it should inevitably be working. Now, the hamstrings are really just one piece of the pie. If you find that you deal with a hip hike or hip tightness or hip flexor tightness, a lot of the concepts that we covered in this video generally apply to almost any muscle in the body. So if you want to learn more about that, you can go watch another video I did on the body in some way right here.